everybody, it's Miss C, continuing some of our basic clay notes videos. So our last video was the stages of clay from slip to bone dry, just how it dries naturally through the various wetnesses of clay. So right now what we're going to continue with is what happens after it becomes bone dry. And that is, we put it in the kiln to be set on fire! But anyhow, there are 2 rounds of the kiln, and only one of them is actually required to have what you might consider a finished piece. So, the first firing is a bisque fire. B-I-S-Q-U-E. Bisque. So a bisque fire is about, for most of our projects in this particular class, we keep it at what is called cone 04, which is just fancy clay speak for about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's usually between like 1990, it's almost 2,000 degrees. Note that that is hot enough to cremate a human body. So remember, your art teacher does have a plan to kill you, and it's probably going to get rid of your body with this thing. Don't touch it when it's on. It's hot, okay? So it's about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it cooks all the water out of the clay. So remember, whenever you're at bone dry, all of the clay that will all the water that will evaporate naturally has done so, but there's still some water left. It's just the same amount of water that you have in the air. Whenever you cook at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to disintegrate a human body, all of that water is gone. And when that water gets evaporated and cooked out, there's a chemical change in the clay. And basically it becomes a rock. It goes from being something that can absorb water to something that cannot. So any clay that has been bisque fired, you can put water into that jug and it will hold that water. And that water will have to evaporate out because it will no longer absorb in. This is why things like flower pots work, even ones that don't have like a glaze on it or anything. They're just like straight up cooked pottery. Now, this is all that you need for a finished product. You could take a bisque fired piece and you could do several things to it. You could paint it. You can spray paint it. You could color it with crayons. You can use shoe polish. You can put on a coat of gesso and then draw on it. Basically, this surface can be treated in a couple different ways in order for you to get a finished or like pretty piece. You can also just leave it plain. That is very possible. And depending on the kind of clay you use, you might get different colors even. So there are clays that are dark black, red, there's white clays, which is what we normally use for class. You can get mason pigments and get your clay to be different colors just from the get-go. But once it's been bisque fired, like, you can do any of these things to it and call it good. Now, that said, what most people think of is they think of glazing. Glazing, super fancy. Glaze is a paint. I put this in parentheses because it's not really paint. That is created with silica, water, pigment, flux, and clay. Silica is just a mineral, helps everything stick together. Water to make it actually brushable. Pigment is the stuff that gives it color. Flux is a material that allows everything to melt and stick together. And clay is clay. It helps it stick to the clay. So it looks and functions very similarly to paint, but depending on your pigments might act very different once it gets cooked. So once you have glaze, you need to do a glaze fire. So it goes on, looks super dusty, looks musty, dusty, crusty, and kind of pastel version of what you're actually aiming for. And you're like, hey, this isn't what I aimed for. I wanted red, not pink. But then you stick it in the kiln for a kiln firing, so a glaze fire. Yeah-huh, 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 yeah-huh. So your clay goes into the kiln twice, usually. Now, the glaze fire is a little bit less hot than a bisque fire. A glaze fire is usually somewhere between like 1400 degrees Fahrenheit to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of ours are usually around here at that 1800 mark, which is still really hot, but not quite enough to get rid of a human body, but really close. And what this does is it melts the flux and pigment and seals it to the surface of your ceramic. The end result is usually very colorful, shiny, and glass-like. There are several different types of finish that you can get on a glaze, but the usual one that you are going to think of is very shiny. It is going to be very glossy. It's going to essentially tap like glass. It's going to look a lot like glass or like colorful glass that's been stuck to the front, which it basically is. The silica will turn into glass. So that's where it gets its glossiness and stuff from as well. There are types of glaze that will not be shiny. So always double check your particular glaze that you're using to see if it's going to get the finish and the effect that you want. Most of ours are going to be shiny just because that's what our kids expect. There are ways to get non-colorful ones as well. You can get clear versions and all of that. But again, double check what you're actually using to know what it's going to end up looking like. But be aware that when it first goes on, dusty. When it comes out of the kiln and it's melted a little bit, very shiny. So yeah, that is the kiln and getting all of the glaze down. So if you're in our classes, you're not done till you've got your glaze fire. Otherwise, you have lots of options for you.
Woohoo!
Right?
Do a scan. Alrighty, one more time. Adios.
Bye.